talk to you too. My name's Paula Roby. I am Marianne Williamson's state director for the state of Iowa, also a lifelong Iowan. I was born and raised in Cedar Rapids, went to undergrad at UNI and law school at Iowa. And I am so happy to be working for this wonderful woman, and I cannot wait for you to get to talk to her, to listen to her. Please know that we have volunteers over at our table. You can sign up for our emails and get swag, all sorts of wonderful things. Thank you so much for coming. Let me introduce you to Marianne Williamson.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Very exciting. I can't even imagine. I can't think of a better place to be a college student than in Iowa, because every 4 years there's this onslaught. I'm 67 years old, and I think, age is an interesting thing. It's like every decade you feel like you're in a room, in a big mansion, and every room is different than every other room. And you're simply not in the room that you used to be in. You're in the room that you're in now. And in the next decade, you'll be in another room. And I've come to believe that the older you are, the more you know certain things. And the younger you are, the more you know certain other things. The younger you are, the more you know what's happening now. But the older you are, the more you know about things that don't change. And you know about cycles, and you know about patterns that repeat themselves. And you also start to have a feeling when you get a certain age that, like they talk about in myth about being the keeper of the story. And so I feel, as a woman who's 67, I want to say something to all of you. It wasn't always this way. It wasn't always this way. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't this way. And I want you to have a sense of that narrative as it relates to your life. But I also think all of us as Americans, no matter how old we are, need now to have a greater sense of the larger narrative of American history. Just like when you go to therapy and you learn about your family. And it helps you, it empowers you to know where some of this came from, your parents and their parents. Or if you're a black person, or if you're a Jewish person, or you're a gay person, if you're a woman, when we sort of try to understand the history of our tribe, or our particular culture. It empowers us, because when we have a greater sense of what those before us did, we have a greater sense of our responsibility towards those who will come after us. I think right now we need to all have a greater sense of who we are as Americans, in a deep sense, in a real sense, in an honest sense, because there are some things we need to correct, but there are also some things we need to own and celebrate. But more than anything, we need to do those things in order to recalibrate, in order that this country can have a different history. When I said to you that it wasn't always this way, I want to go back to the 1970s when I was in college. That was before wealth inequality happened. It wasn't this way in the 1970s. In the 1970s, you didn't have 1% of Americans owning more wealth than the bottom 90%. You didn't have 40% of Americans living in chronic economic anxiety. We didn't have this wealth inequality crisis on our hands. And it all started in 1980. Because in 1980 was when this huge idea of trickle-down economics just came upon us. It was an assault. And we don't have time to go into all the specifics. I know there's certainly, some of you probably know all the specifics, but just for our purposes here tonight, to have a sense of the overarching drama of what got us to this point. Until that point, believe it or not, I know you might find it shocking, the US corporation was actually expected to care. Can you imagine? It was actually expected to care. If somebody had worked for the company for 10 years, it was kind of the social contract. It was understood that the corporation should care about whether or not that person had a dignified retirement. But starting in 1980s, this onslaught of an economic theory called trickle-down economics that came out of the Chicago School of Economics, the main articulator was a man named Milton Friedman. But I want to tell you something really interesting about Milton Friedman in a moment that might surprise you. It surprised me when I first learned it. The idea was that the government should get out of the way, And that short-term profit for huge, not necessarily huge, but for corporations, short-term profits for corporations, the expansion of short-term profits for stockholders, basically, the idea was that that should be the ordering principle for our civilization. And the idea, of course, would be that if you increase the profit for stockholders, then all that money, they'd make all this money, but all that money was going to trickle down to everybody else because they were going to create all these jobs. All that money would trickle down and it would lift all boats. Well, I think after 40 years, we understand that it did not lift all boats. It has left millions of people without even a life vest. And it's basically this aristocratic royalist notion, FDR called it economic royalism, that a few corporate aristocrats would sit up on high and they would drop these crumbs from their table in the form of job creation. Well, this actually has had devastating effects, as we know. It's destroyed America's middle class, taken us to where we are today. Now, this at this point amounts to nothing short of a regression to an aristocratic system. Now, if you go back all the way to 1776, we repudiated an aristocratic system in 1776. This country was born of a revolutionary fervor. It was born of people saying it's actually not okay for just a small group of people to be the only ones entitled to wealth creation, to education, to ownership, etc. But even in 1776, it was a gnarly story from the beginning. Because on one hand, the people who signed the Declaration of Independence repudiating aristocracy, saying all men were created equal, saying God gave all men inalienable rights of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, saying that governments were instituted to secure those rights, saying that it's the rights of the people to alter it or abolish it if the government's not doing their job. 41 signers of that Declaration of Independence, which was a majority, were themselves slave owners. We've been both from the beginning. It has been with us from the beginning. It's in America's DNA. It's in our characterological DNA. It's been with us in every generation, yours and mine no less, and in a way no differently than in any other. On one hand, we are founded on the most extraordinarily enlightened aspirational principles. It is earth-shattering. It was earth-shattering. It is earth-shattering. It is radical. It is the idea that anybody should have a shot. Anybody. Doesn't matter who they are, doesn't matter where they come from, doesn't matter what they believe, anybody should have a shot. And that the government's job is to making sure they do. The government's job is to uncap any limits, unleash their spirit, and let them soar. The very possibility of that possibility is extraordinary. On the other hand, we've never fully actualized it. We always say, and we do believe in our hearts, that it's the job of every generation to actualize it further, expand it further, to create a more perfect union. But from the beginning, in every generation, we have been both people whose hearts were ablaze by that idea, and forces which were at times the most violent perpetrators of transgression against those principles. Every American is part of that story. And every generation plays out its chapter. Every generation writes its chapter as the story unfolds. It's like a novel that never ends. Every generation writes its own story. But every generation basically is living the same bipolarity. And the more you know about how it's been played out before, I believe the more empowered you are. And if you look at the unfolding narrative, yeah, we've had some serious problems, but we have also had some kick-ass problem solvers. We had slavery, but then we also had the abolitionist movement. We had the suppression of women, but we also had the women's suffragette movement, and we've had two major waves of feminism. We had institutionalized white supremacy and segregation. We also had the civil rights movement. We had the denial of marriage equality to gay people, and then we had the marriage equality movement. We've had, God knows, genocide and cultural annihilation of Native Americans, and even now, people are standing up at Standing Rock. So the issue is, where are we? What has happened? And what's our responsibility? Well, I'll tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. What trickled, and everyone else, what trickled down economics has come to represent is nothing short of a new economic tyranny. What it has done by taking a massive transfer of wealth into the hands of a small group of people, leaving 40% of Americans living with chronic economic anxiety, has created a situation where our government, and everybody knows this is not news to anybody. I'm not telling anyone on this campaign anything we don't already know. The issue is the data collection is over. The issue is to own what we know. And to recognize that because of this massive transfer of wealth, we have moved, for all intents and purposes, from being a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, an ideal for which men and women have died. This is a government of a few of the people by, of the major multinational corporations, by multinational corporations, of multinational corporations, and for major multinational corporations. What I say to you is this. We're not the first generation to have to deal with this stuff. Let's just not be the first generation to whip out and do what it takes to put this country back on track. Donald Trump did not create all this. Donald Trump was created by all this. Donald Trump is an opportunistic infection, and he could not have gotten hold of us had there not been a weakened societal immune system, and that's each and every one of us. I think the first thing we have to do is own that we allow this to happen. I've worked for 35 years. Not so much you guys. You guys are young. You're absolved. Most of us, though, have to recognize that we acquiesced too many times, in too many ways, compromising in places where we shouldn't have, and allowed this to happen. And I say that because, and this is what the skill set that I feel I bring to this campaign, why I believe that I'm qualified, and why I believe that the qualifications that I have actually make me a good idea for the job. I've worked very up close and personal for 35 years with people in times of crisis, people who need their lives to transform. And all that a country is a group of people. The same psychological, emotional, and spiritual and moral issues that prevail within the life of an individual prevail within the life of a nation. And one of the first things you have to do is ask yourself, what was my part in this? If you don't take care of your body, you can't be that shocked when you get sick. If you don't take care of your marriage, you can't be that shocked when your partner leaves. If you don't take care of your business or your money, you can't be that shocked when your business or your money goes south. We did not take care of our democracy. Once again, for those of you who are young and in college, I'm not saying you personally, but I'm saying that about us, the American people. And that's because we took our eye off the ball. Some of the best and the brightest in America became chronically disengaged from politics. We thought the American Revolution was a done deal. The American Revolution is not a done deal. The American Revolution, as it turns out, is an ongoing process. And we need to reclaim the revolutionary fervor. We need to reclaim the rambunctiousness of the American spirit. We need to reclaim a polite and a stylish and an elegant. Hell no, no more of that shit. The Trump administration represents an immoral agenda, but it's not enough to just say that. We need to cultivate a moral agenda. And so I want to tell you what I will do if I'm president of the United States, because you're voters in Iowa. You're voters, and you get to be the decider. So I want you to know what your option is should you vote for me. I see five pillars of a moral politics. Number one, obviously, to deal with the immorality of our economic system at the moment. Our economic system has corrupted an amoral economic system, as I've already described to you. It is amoral. It is not of itself immoral. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, ooh, let's destroy an Amazon indigenous tribe. They don't wake up in the morning and say, ooh, let's make life hard for the college kids. That's not what they do. They just don't feel it's their responsibility to have to care one way or the other. So anytime you have that kind of amorality, it will lead to immoral consequences, right? So first thing we have to do, we have to take our economics back to a moral core. Some people believe that it is impossible for capitalism to have an ethical center. I'm actually somebody who doesn't think that it's impossible to have an ethical center. That's my belief. I believe we can have capitalism with a conscience. But it is the history, once again going back to the history of the United States, it is the most American, most traditionally American thing to do, to push back against overreach by capitalism when they needed to be put back in their place. That's why we have unions in this country. That's why we have child labor laws. That's why we have antitrust laws. It's the most American thing to do, to say, go back where you belong. Back where you are one element. You're an important element, but you're certainly no more important than our children. Get back where you belong. Maybe it'll take a woman to say that. So that's number one. How do we do that? What we need is this. We need to repeal the 2017 tax cut that gave $2 trillion tax cut. 83 cents of every dollar went to the very richest individuals and corporations. I believe we should repeal the tax cut. We should put back in the middle class tax cut, which I think should have been there anyway. We need to stop those corporate subsidies, $26 billion to oil and gas alone last year. Martin Luther King used to say, if they give it to rich people, they call it a subsidy. If they give it to poor people, they call it a handout. Next thing we need to do is face what Big Pharma has done to this country. We need to realize, it's not just Big Pharma, it's health insurance companies, it's gun manufacturers, it's oil and gas, it's chemical companies, it's food companies, it's defense contractors, it's nuclear industry. It's this matrix of aristocratic power. We have a government that does more to advocate for their short-term profits than to advocate for us, the people of the United States, the people of the world, and the planet on which we live. All of us need to rise up and say, that stops now. One of the ways that has shown itself, I remind you, for instance, last year, Big Pharma lobbied Congress to the tune of $284 million. Oil and gas last year lobbied to the tune of $125 million. And when those guys lobby $284 million, they want something in exchange. There's a quid pro quo. And the quid pro quo that they got a few years ago was that the United States government gave away its right to negotiate with big pharmaceutical companies to lower drug prices, which is why people in the United States today cannot afford their insulin. And those people who cannot afford their insulin, just like kids who don't know how they're going to pay their college loans, just like people who don't know how they're going to send their kids to college, are human beings. They are not just data on a page. The right of the government. We need to take back the right of the government in order to negotiate drug prices. Next thing we have to do is we have to look at our military spending. Our military should have what they say they need for our legitimate security concerns. I assure you, the U.S. Air Force ordering 100 planes that all can drop the B-21 Raiders that cost $560 million each. 100 of them, and they can all drop not only regular bombs, but also nuclear bombs. Ladies and gentlemen, what kind of fools are we for us to think that that's just for our national security? You drop 5 of those, it's over for the human civilization as we know it. You drop 10 of those, it's over for the species. So I'm not critiquing the U.S. military. That's not where my critique lies. My critique is of the political decisions by which, for the purposes of short-term profits for defense contractors, we spend up to hundreds of billions of dollars more than our military says that they need. $760 billion at least every year on the military spending. In addition to that, we say to billionaires, some of whom I do believe made their money in righteous commerce, good for them. I will say to them, love you guys, we'd like 3%, please, of every $1 billion of your assets. In addition to that, and I think it's important that we realize there are billionaires in this country who agree with that. And there are gazillionaires who agree with this when I say that if you have $15 billion, we would like 2% tax on your assets. We're going to do all the things that I just mentioned, and guess what? We're going to have cash on hand, and let me tell you what we're going to do with that. First thing we are going to do is recognize that we have millions of traumatized, chronically traumatized children in the United States of America. We have millions of American children who go to school hungry every day. We have 13 million food insecure children. We have millions of American children who go to school every day asking the teacher if they have something for them to eat. We have millions of American children who go to school every day in classrooms that don't even have the adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read. And if a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, the chances of high school graduation are drastically decreased, the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. We have millions of American children who live in what's called America's domestic war zones, and yes, some of them are in Iowa, who are experiencing, psychologists tell us, a level of PTSD that is no less severe than the PTSD of a returning veteran from Afghanistan or Iraq. I also point out that for a returning veteran, it's post-traumatic stress. For these kids, it's present traumatic stress because it's triggered and re-triggered every day. This is a vast sea of unnecessary suffering, and we should be rescuing these children no differently than if they were the victims of a natural disaster. We have a virulent strain of capitalism. I've already said I'm not anti-capitalist per se. What we have right now, however, is a virulent strain of capitalism that has corrupted our government, that has hijacked our moral value system. It requires cheap labor, and the two groups it can do without, it doesn't need them, it doesn't serve, are children and old people. We need to rise up. That needs to stop now. We should not be running this country like a business, thank you. We should be running this country like a family. And this is why I want a United States Department of Children and Youth. We need a massive, massive realignment of investment in the direction of America's children. Massive realignment. Because the 90% of the development of a child's brain happens before the age of 5. Now, to all of you who are women, I want to point out that the U.S. economic system was designed before women had a voice in the public realm. And at that time, raising a child was just, it was a woman's work. We do have a voice now, though. We do have a voice now. And one of the voices and one of the things is to say, babies first, children first, and then we'll talk. When we do that, when we have the massive realignment of investment in the direction of our children, when we have a United States Department of Children and Youth, we need this because a Department of Education is not enough. Health and Human Services, families, and children are not enough. We need beyond even that. We need beyond universal preschool, which of course we need. But we need what I saw here today, here in Iowa. You have it just as we have it in every state. You have the social workers, you have the experts in early childhood education, you have the teachers, we have what we need. These are not the people who are resourced, these are not the people who are funded. Maybe the government will throw them $1 million. Great. While it's giving $100 million to certain forces whose policies make sure that this suffering will be so inevitable, so everybody's on this wheel of suffering all the time. No amount of private charity can compensate for a basic lack of social justice. It's wrong. I have been in the nonprofit world. I have founded nonprofit organizations. I founded peace organizations. I founded AIDS organizations. I know the importance of the nonprofit sector. But the nonprofit sector can't just keep cleaning up a mess made by bad public policy. They just need to stop making such bad public policy. Bad public policy got us here. Good public policy will begin a season of repair. Realize that a system, the richest country in the world, that does not give every child an opportunity to actualize their potential and develop their brain, that is nothing short of oppression. We are one of very few countries in this world that base our educational funding on property taxes. That means that if a child is raised in a well-to-do neighborhood, that child has a very good chance of a fine public school education. If they're not, too bad. Who do you think all those people are? Among the 2.3 million people in our private prison system. We can't just treat the symptom, ladies and gentlemen, we have to treat the cause. Start with that. Number 2, and I think that this is something that I'm sure many people in this audience recognize, because I think that many of America's young people do recognize. We need a World War II mass mobilization to reverse climate change. Nothing short of that. The reasons I'm running for president is because I'm tired of the way the political system talks to us like we're children. If you go to the doctor and the test results are not good, you expect the doctor to tell you the truth. You have to know if the test results aren't good, because how else are you going to then have the focus and the intelligence to talk about what to do about it? My 35-year career, working very up close and personal with people who go through some really tough, traumatic times, is that sometimes it's when people hear the bad news that they get their most intelligent, that people become their most noble. So I don't relate to a political system that doesn't really want to be negative or sound negative or go into how bad things really are. This is not the time for denial. This is not the time for denial about the state of our country, the state of our children, and the state of our planet. This is a time for us to be really deep thinkers. This is time for us to get real. Because if we talk about what's really wrong, then we will get to the place where we can talk about, hey, we're Americans, and we can make them right. If we do not, within the next 12 years, fundamentally reverse climate change, we could be facing amounts of social collapse, the likes of which we have not seen in the modern era. We could be seeing food shortages. We could be seeing whole swaths of countries, even continents, uninhabitable because of the heat, because the food cannot be grown. We know what we need to do. We need to sequester the carbon. We know we need to reforest. We know what we need to do. We know we need to develop alternative, sustainable sources of energy and transportation. We know we need to deal with the animal factory farming. We know that we need to shift from a dirty economy to a clean economy. But we will not be able to do this with anything short of a mass World War II level mobilization. And also one of the things that I believe I bring to the table is that we have to recognize that the people who have been in charge of the industrial level harm to the earth are the people that we're going to be needing to help us in industrial level repair of the earth. This will be a transition. And we need someone who knows how to navigate the transition in order that an agent of change does not become an agent of chaos. Because we need people enrolled. We need people to understand that this is not oppositional. We didn't fight World War II, Democrats fighting Republicans. Democrats and Republicans were together in World War II, and Americans need to be together in a mass mobilization to deal with climate crisis. The next thing we need to do, the next pillar of a moral politics, is we need to realize that a country, just like an individual, cannot have the future that we want if we're not willing to clean up the past. Today is the Jewish New Year of Rosh Hashanah, and that means the beginning of 10 days that are called the Days of Awe. At the end of those 10 days is Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year in the Jewish calendar. That is the Day of the Atonement. The Day of the Atonement in Judaism is very similar to Catholics going to confession, which is very similar to people at an AA meeting, knowing you have to take a fearless moral inventory and admit the exact nature of your character defects. America needs to do that. Racism is our original character defect. I do not believe, it is not my experience or my belief that the average American is a racist. But it is my belief that the average American is woefully undereducated about the history of race in the United States. The first slave ships came here in 1619, and slavery was not abolished until 1865. That's just short of 250 years. At the end of that time, there were between 4 and 5 million enslaved persons, and they were promised by General Tecumseh Sherman that every former slave family of 4 would be given 40 acres and a mule. Just think about this for a moment. You're told you're no longer a slave. Where are you supposed to go? What are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to feed your children? That's what 40 acres and a mule would have given. That promise was rescinded after the federal troops left 12 years after the end of the war. All hell broke loose. Southern legislatures passed what were called the Black Code laws to ensure subpar economic and social and political opportunities for black people. What followed then, what amounts to another 100 years after the end of the Civil War, of an era of domestic terror. What do you call lynching if not domestic terror? What do you call the Ku Klux Klan if not domestic terror? What do you call segregation if not domestic terror? 100 years after the end of the Civil War, they passed the Civil Rights Act, which dismantled segregation. 1 year later, they passed the Voting Rights Act, which gave equal access to the polls to black people. But let's be very clear, ladies and gentlemen, in some ways we're even sliding backwards. 2013, they started chipping away at the Voting Rights Act, which is why we have all these voter suppression efforts all over the country. We have racial disparity in criminal sentencing, criminal justice, all of the issues that we know we have, mass incarceration itself. Now, for me, we will heal this country on the level of moral values. That is the level where we will meet, and that's also which we can wage a successful replacement drive so that Donald Trump will no longer live in the White House. However, it is a moral issue, I'm sure you'd agree with me. If you've been kicking people to the ground, and I'm sure we'd all agree that 350 years of violence is kicking people to the ground, I would think you would agree with me that you owe those people something. Two things. Number one, stop kicking. But number two, here, let me help you get back up. That's why we need reparations for slavery. There is a difference between race-based policies and reparations. Race-based policies give economic restitution. Race-based reparations carry moral force, because reparations are an acknowledgement on the part of one people of a wrong that has been done, a debt that is owed, and the willingness on the part of people to pay it. I'm not saying it's going to fix everything, but it will do more than incremental change. And no, we do not need another commission or another study. I think we have the evidence. Germany has paid $89 billion to Jewish organizations since World War II. I'm not saying it means the Holocaust didn't happen, but it has gone far towards establishing reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Europe. I propose $200 to $500 billion to be dispersed over 20 years. It would just be dispersed through a reparations council of people who are themselves descended from American slaves. The stipulation on the part of the US government is to be this, that the money is to be used for purposes of economic and educational renewal. Beyond that, white America should not be saying how the money is spent. If I owe you money, I don't get to tell you how to spend it. It's just part of the same paternalism. All this race-based policy, it's so paternalistic. I messed with you. No, I will tell you how I'm going to fix it. No, 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 no. The moral force of all this will be the actual paying of reparations. In addition to this, we need some reparative measures regarding Native Americans. It's not as simple, because with Native Americans it has to do with treaties that were unfairly negotiated, treaties that have not been upheld, giving back to the Sioux of the Black Hills, most of the Black Hills of South Dakota. It has to do with the Savannah Act and dealing with murdered and missing indigenous women. But with both Native Americans and Black Americans, what I'm saying to you, ladies and gentlemen, is Americans are hardwired to do great things. We're not hardwired for small things. Politics has become about small things. Well, we're going to do this here, and then we're going to have this policy there, and it's going to be anti-discrimination there, and all this stuff that just kind of makes your eyes glaze over. That's not what politics should be. Politics should be big, it should be bold, it should be an act of love, it should be an act of brilliance, it should be an act of creativity. And all political policy, both domestic and international, should be based on one core principle. Do what helps people thrive. Do what helps people thrive. Reparations is an asset. Reparations will be an economic stimulus. I'm talking about $200 to $500 billion. Look at that $2 trillion tax cut. That's no stimulus at all. There's no even evidence that shows that it will ever even pay for itself. You see, this is how the American people have been fooled. All the things that would actually help people, all the things that would actually educate people, all the things that would actually say, you don't even have to worry about how your kids are going to go to college. You don't even have to worry about it, because there's going to be free tuition at state colleges and universities. You don't even worry about it, kids. You don't have to worry about these college loans. Why? America will be better off if you can soar. America will be better off if you can create and you can produce. That's where money comes from. Hell, there are so many ways we can pay for that. You have a $1.5 trillion student loan debt. Well, I'll trade you that for that $2 trillion tax cut. Don't let them tell you we don't have the money for any of this stuff. Don't let them tell you that. Don't let them tell you that. We need to stop transferring the money into the hands of a very, very few Americans. And then I'm going to tell you one last thing, which is the pillar of this moral politics. And I'm so sorry that you have to be loaded down with this, because you should be young and having a good time. But you know what? Crises are never convenient. They're not convenient in the life of an individual, and they're never convenient in the life of a nation, but sometimes they happen. And when we rise up, I don't think the abolitionists had an easy time, but they rose up and they changed things. And the women's suffragettes didn't have an easy time, but they rose up and they changed things. Civil rights movement didn't have an easy time, but they rose up and they changed things. And that's an important part of the historical narrative for you to realize as well, for all of us to realize. The government didn't wake up and say, let's end slavery. The government didn't wake up and say, let's give women the right to vote. The government didn't wake up and say, let's desegregate the South. It was people. It was the suffragettes. It was the abolitionists. It was the civil rights movement. And right now, we're living in a time where the government, all these people from the government coming to tell you they're going to fix all this. No, they're not. They're going to perpetuate all this. That's what the status quo does, ladies and gentlemen. Let us not be fooled. This is not a time for us to ask the same system that has driven us into this ditch to please, would you please, pretty please, drive us out of the ditch? No, this is one of those times for the American people to rise up and step in. It's ours to do. The power is ours. And now one last thing has to do with our national security. We spend $760 billion that we know of on our military every year. We spend $40 billion on our State Department. Our State Department is development, diplomacy, and mediation. Now, you can't just take medicine, you have to cultivate health. Because sickness is the absence of health. Health isn't the absence of sickness. And you can't just endlessly prepare for war. We have a national security agenda that's basically just endless preparation for war. What, we're going to back ourselves into peace? War is the absence of peace. Peace is not the absence of war. And yet, if you look at the way we spend our money, the $760 billion in military, then $40 billion on the State Department. Within the State Department, we spend $17 billion on the USAID, which is long-term development and humanitarian assistance, less than $1 billion on our peace-building agencies. Now let's talk about what would create peace. Because there are a couple things there that we really do need to remember. Number one, all men are created equal. Those children, they're equal too. Like those children in those cages, they're equal too. Number two, God gave all men inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Where's the right of those children to pursue happiness? Where's the right of somebody who works hard but has to work 2 or 3 jobs just to put food on the table? Where's their right to pursue happiness? But then it gets even juicier. I mentioned it already, but let's all take it in. It's the government's job to secure those rights. And then, drum roll, it's the right of the people, when government's not doing that job, to alter it or abolish it. I'll tell you something, ladies and gentlemen, I'm certainly not suggesting that we abolish it, but you better believe I'm suggesting that we alter it. I'm suggesting that we alter it, and I'm suggesting we alter it fundamentally, and I'm suggesting we alter it quickly. That's why I want a United States Department of Peace. I want there to be as robust and simultaneous a commitment to the agencies of peace building as to the agencies of the military. Politics. Put our economic system back on the core principle of ethics and conscience. Department of Children and Youth, for the extraordinary humanitarian crisis we have of chronically suffering millions of American children. A World War II level mass mobilization for climate reversal. Reparations for slavery, reparative measures towards Native Americans, and the United States Department of Peace. And by saying something that we as Americans need to be very sophisticated about in our understanding. Donald Trump won in large part because of a group called Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica is a military-grade propaganda weapon. It was developed for warfare. The capacity of those programs to manipulate, to trigger, and to dismantle the functioning of human reason through propagandistic tools, much from shadow data mining, is almost beyond imagining. A traditional political campaign based on intellectual analysis and emotional persuasion is going to have a very difficult time. I think in many ways we're in denial about the level of opposition that exists right now to genuine democratic principles. There's only one thing that overrides fear. Fear, like that which can be harnessed for political purposes and which is already being harnessed for political purposes, can override human reason. There's only one thing that can override fear, and that is our capacity to love. Our capacity to love one another turned into a cohesive political narrative. Our love for each other, our love for our children, our love for our earth, our love for future generations, our love for democracy, inspires something in us, motivates us in ways that nothing else does. And so I say to you what I said to somebody else who said to me, running for president, what does she know how to do? She motivates people. She inspires people. I said to that person, I say to you too, you might want to think about that. We have a lot more lovers and haters in this country, but conviction is a force multiplier. And those who hate, the bigots and the racists and the anti-Semites and the homophobes and the Islamophobes and the xenophobes, they're active and they're politicized. There's never been a more dangerous phenomenon on the planet than hate collectivized and politicized. A lot more lovers than haters. But those who love in this country too often have kept the inquiry into what makes life good. And I do think we're a good people, and I do think Americans care about being good. I don't think the problem is with the consciousness of the American people. But the American people over the last few decades have limited the purview of the inquiry into what makes for a good life too much to the limits of the personal self. We have to think not only, was I good to you just now? Was I judgmental? Should I be more forgiving? It has to be more than just you or me. We also have to think, was it good that we, for the sake of $350 billion in arms sales to Saudi Arabia, are giving aerial support to a genocidal war that is starving people in Yemen, tens of thousands of people, some of whom are children? The problem is not that we don't love. The problem is that too often we love our own children, but we're forgetting to love enough the children on the other side of town and the children on the other side of the world. We need what Martin Luther King called coalitions of conscience. And yes, that means liberals as well as conservatives. It means Democrats as well as Republicans. You notice that I have not mentioned very much this evening our president. My hope, and it should be yours too, is to make him irrelevant as soon as possible.
Especially like in the executive branch. Do you think the Senate should be abolished? Because I know that's something that has been proposed.
I know, I heard someone propose it too. No. Oh, easy. Yes, ma'am.
So, you mentioned American factory farming.
Yes.
And in Iowa, pork and beef are the biggest part of our economy here. And I know most people grew up on farms here. Would you ban beef and pork industry?
No, I wouldn't ban them. I wouldn't ban them. But I would.
Regulation?
There's definitely there need, the methane gas, the nitrous oxide. Even if we do everything else that we want to do in terms of climate reversal, if we don't handle the nitrous oxide and the methane gas, we're going to have a real big problem. Everybody needs to accommodate to the times in which we live. But you know what? I think there's a difference. Somebody once said to me, pointed out to me the difference between the word sacrifice and renounce. You sacrifice, it means you're giving up something. I don't think anyone needs to sacrifice, but all of us need to forego the lower for the sake of the higher. So who would I talk to? I would talk to the people in Iowa. I would not want to be a president who thinks that people in Washington should decide what Iowa should do about this. That's kind of not, I mean, the federalism of the United States, something powerful about this. Alexander Hamilton said that the states should be laboratories of reform. Iowa knows the problems in Iowa. I don't believe that environmental scientists in Washington know better than Iowa does about flood control in Iowa. I don't believe that environmental scientists in Washington know more about forest fires in California than environmentalists do in California. And I don't think that anybody in Washington or anyone outside Iowa knows as much as people in Iowa know about what to do about the specifics of the issues of farming in this state, the issues of the topsoil, the issues of biodiversity, the issues of agricultural regeneration, and the issues of the factory farming. So for me, it would start there. I would not be a president that wants to start dictating to Iowa. I would be a president who would come to Iowa and say, could we please have a meeting? We need to talk. Yes?
So I know in a lot of like your self-help. I know in a lot of like your self-help writing, you've talked about a lot of things about how like mental health problems. It's more of, let me know if I'm misquoting you, but like it's more about like self-realization and like reflection than like medicating. And I know like how does that really affect like your mental health care policy?
Well, first of all, when it comes to mental health, I think the first thing we need to ask ourselves, it's just like with physical health, there's a lot of talk about how we're going to pay for health care. The first thing we need to ask is, why is there so much more chronic illness in the United States than in other comparable democracies? So if we're going to talk about health in the United States, and I believe we should, we need to do more than talk about how are we going to pay for health care. We need to talk about our food policies. We need to talk about our chemical policies. We need to talk about our environmental policies. We even need to talk about our economic policies. Our economics give so much stress to people. In other words, we need to deal with the issue of cause. So for me, when we talk about mental health issues in the United States, my first issue is, why are so many people in such mental anxiety and pain to begin with? What kind of a world have we created? And I feel that this applies to the opioid crisis. Obviously, predatory pharmaceutical practices apply to that, but also mental health issues. Now, I don't think of myself as a self-help author, by the way, but I do think of myself as someone who writes about all the universal religious and spiritual themes, which it's at peak. Those things and psychotherapy are the same thing. So yes, I do believe that one of the reasons people are in such anxiety and stress in this country is because we are not here for one another. There's not enough love. There's not enough community. There's not enough deep relationship. And so much of what I'm talking about tonight, and making economics rather than humanitarian principles the bottom line, has put people at odds with each other, put people at odds with nature, put people at odds with their own ability to be the people living the lives that we wish to live. Now, once people are living with deep depression, anxiety, etc., there are many ways that these things can be treated. I do not have judgment on any of them. What I have said and will continue to say, and what I think it is naive for us as a people to not question, given that we are even now seeing attorneys general all over this country indicting big pharmaceutical executives for their known role in the opioid crisis, for their known role in over-manufacturing and leading to the over-prescription and over-advertising of painkillers. Do I think that there should be painkillers? Absolutely, of course, because some people really need them. But do I think that big pharmaceutical companies practice predatory practices in order to over-manufacture and oversell? Obviously they did. And I believe the same thing about everything else, with the coziness of the FDA and the CDC and big pharmaceutical companies. So I do not apologize for the fact that in my writings, as well as my talks, I have at various times questioned. Many mental health care professionals have questioned. Should people use antidepressants if they want them? Absolutely. Of course, absolutely. However, I do believe that there are some situations that are within the purview of normal human despair. Getting divorced is painful. It's not a mental illness. Losing your business is painful. It's not a mental illness. Being in your 20s, as I remember, is painful. But it's not being into 30s. Many of these pills are addictive, and so I do not apologize for the fact that I have questioned what could be seen as possibly an over-pharmaceuticalization of the American population, particularly American women. American women's pain should not be just a gold mine for drug manufacturers. And when they say, oh, Ms. Williamson, you're not a mental health professional, do you know how many women get their antidepressants from their gynecologists? So I think anybody, I have never said, I have never written any judgment. Everybody should do what they feel that they need to do. And throughout my career, I'm not an advice giver, but I am a question asker. And I don't understand, you know, I read a quote one day, it was a tweet actually, from someone from Croatia. And he said about the Americans, I've never known a people to protect so passionately their abusers. I think the coziness of the FDA with big pharmaceutical companies, the coziness of the FAA with Boeing, and the coziness of every other of the EPA with chemical companies and oil companies should make every American say this needs to stop. Why should that be criticized? What we should ask ourselves is, why is someone who is suggesting that, why are they working so hard to peripheralize and mock that candidate? Mockery is the new form of character assassination in the United States. Just put enough doubt in enough people's minds. So I think all of us have to think. So yes, I have said that maybe not everybody who has a rough time needs to have that as the first option. Maybe that might be at least the second option. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
So there's been a lot of discussion about the inverted yield curve when it comes to treasury bonds. Are you worried we're on the brink of another recession?
I think that we could be, yes. But see, the main problem is that our economy is not on a morally stable basis. And so until and unless our economy is on a morally stable basis, there will always be things to worry about, because there's no deep underground of that which is right relationship. Does that make sense?
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, just they told me one more question. Yes, ma'am. Oh, I'm sorry, I told this. Yes. Yes.
All right, so one area of the world that we often tend to forget about in American foreign policy is sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm wondering that, what would you do as president to help our African allies continue to prosper?
Continue to prosper?
Or the African continent is projected, if not already, to be the fastest growing economic place in the world.
As the Chinese are well aware, and the Russians are well aware.
And as China has been beating us to the punch in a lot of investment in the area, how would you, as president, address America's relationship with our sub-Saharan African allies, potential allies, while also making sure to tread carefully away from neo-colonialist practices, neo-colonialist practices like the Chinese have been doing with their investments?
Yes. First of all, for me, the season of repair that we need on this planet begins on a humanitarian level. The first thing for me, in terms of Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa particularly, has to do with the fact that the United States should be a moral leader in our foreign policy. And that would mean, first and foremost, dealing with the issues of deep poverty. We have 1 billion people on this planet, they're called the bottom billion, who live on less than $1.25 a day. We have 12,000 children on this planet who starve every day. So when the European and American leaders meet for their fancy G7 meetings, to me the first thing on the agenda should be global poverty. That's number one. Should be global poverty. We have a situation where in 10 years, if we decided to, we could easily eradicate deep poverty from the world. As soon as deep poverty is eradicated from sub-Saharan Africa, the point right there is that as soon as you have money, you have power that you did not have before you had money. So Africa, right now, even in your questioning, we're talking about how is America going to help Africa. There are a lot of Africans, the more enlightened Africans, who have a problem with the fact that we're even languaging it that way. Right? So to me, the first question is how we might stand up as moral leaders and realize that when there are starving people, the first thing you do is that. Secondly, there is such a thing, I believe, as righteous commerce. And as you know from what you said, China's in there. China's in there, Russia's in there. They know the minerals that are there. They know what is offered in terms of possibility and potential. I would like the United States to practice righteous commerce rather than any kind of economic imperialism around the world. I feel that way not just about Sub-Saharan Africa. I feel that about a lot of places, including Latin America, thank you very much. Right? So this is something I want everywhere. But the first thing, I want to help people thrive. And then it will be up to the Africans themselves, whether they want to do business with the Chinese, whether they want to do business with the Americans, whether they want to do business with the Russians. I honestly believe that what we do offer in terms of liberal values, this is the issue. We have always been attractive to the world because we stood for the liberal Western values that matter. Right now we don't. So right now, I'm not surprised if they say, I think I'll play with China. I think I'll play with Russia. Because what do we offer that is truly special? We used to, and I'm not saying, I started tonight by saying I don't want to romanticize America's past. I'm not saying we ever got it right. But I can tell you in my lifetime, there was a time when there was at least a consensus we were supposed to try. And that is how life operates. First, you get yourself aligned with genuine right living. Do the right thing. Be who you're supposed to be, whether you're a person or a country. You'll attract business. You'll attract relationships. It'll happen. Because I believe that when America really is who we say we are, I think that we would have more than a fighting shot at being the ones that Africans would wish to work with. I do believe that. But first, I want to be a leader in making sure that global poverty is eradicated from that area. Sir, in the back here. Just one more. Yes, sir.
All right, so you're talking about the economic system and capitalism. If you're president, what are you going to do for our economic system? How are you going to fix that? What specific policies are you going to enact as president?
Well, one of the things I already mentioned, we need to repeal that 2017 tax cut. Repeal that 2017 tax cut, put back in the middle class tax cut. As I already said, we need to stop those corporate subsidies. Take back the right to negotiate drug prices. Actually enforce antitrust laws. There are many things that are basically the standard principles of right economic relationship that the United States needs to reclaim. You do those things, sir. And the other thing I'll do is this. On my economic councils, you're going to see less standard economists and businessmen in pinstripe suits, and you know what you're going to see a lot of? Elementary school teachers. Because if you want a great economy 20 years from now, I'll tell you what you do. Take better care of your 10-year-olds today. You put me in the White House, you're going to have your own mother there, and you can take that however you want.